In 1981, China voted against the UN resolution in 16 rounds, when the issue was the election of the next UN Secretary-General. In the big arena of diplomacy, there's a lot to learn about being tough, compromising, and achieving balance. This was a significant time for Kurt Waldheim. He was the incumbent Secretary-General of the United Nations. In 1981, it marked the end of his second five-year term. The famous Austrian diplomat had done significantly well during his 10-year tenure as UN Secretary-General. After taking office in 1972, Kurt Waldheim first solved the UN's $65 million financial crisis, and then performed admirably on a number of difficult issues. Those include the Munich Olympics tragedy, the Fourth Middle East War, the Iranian hostage crisis, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, and Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia. His actions were recognized by the majority of UN member states. Waldheim announced that he would run for re-election as the next Secretary-General of the United Nations. If successful, he would become the longest-serving Secretary-General in the history of the organization. His candidacy for a second term is well-founded. Firstly, he is only 63 years old, full of energy and experience. Secondly, he has a good reputation during his tenure, and a number of member states support his re-election. Most importantly, the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, have also expressed their agreement to his re-election. This is the most crucial point. There are two conditions that must be met simultaneously for the UN Secretary-General to be elected. First, at least 9 votes from the 5 permanent and 10 non-permanent members of the UN Security Council. And secondly, there cannot be a single dissenting vote from any of the 5 permanent members, or else there will have to be a new election. From past experience, a candidate for UN Secretary-General has never been vetoed as long as both the US and the USSR agree. Kurt Waldheim, however, was completely unprepared for the fact that his re-election plans were firmly opposed by another permanent member, China. Kurt Waldheim is considered an old friend of the Chinese people. In 1971, when Waldheim stood as a dark horse in the run for the UN Secretary-General, the decisive vote in his overtime battle with Finland's representative Jacobson was cast by China. China had just returned to the UN, and Waldheim was grateful for their support. He had previously expressed his opinion in favor of China's return, with Austria also voting in favor. He stated, "As time goes by, it becomes more and more unbelievable that an island government on the fringe of the Chinese mainland, controlling a population of only 16 million, is attempting to speak on behalf of 1 billion Chinese, which make up a quarter of the human race." A considerable amount of time and energy was spent on the discussion over China's return to the United Nations. Following China's comeback, Waldheim, who was then Austria's permanent representative to the United Nations, made a welcoming statement, expressing, "We are confident that China's participation in the life of the United Nations will strengthen the organization and greatly enhance its capacity to promote and accomplish the purposes and principles of the UN Charter." As stated in his address from the rostrum, Waldheim proclaimed that it's widely acknowledged that without the full participation of the People's Republic of China in the work of the United Nations, it's unrealistic to expect significant progress on many of the issues facing the organization, all of which relate to the fundamental aim of the United Nations, the maintenance of international peace and security. Soon after he was elected, Waldheim visited China, making history as the first UN Secretary-General to do so, and he met with Premier Zhou Enlai. Following his re-election in 1977, Waldheim once more visited China and this time met Hua Guofen, chairman of the Communist Party of China's CPC Central Committee and Premier of the State Council, and Deng Xiaoping, Vice Premier of the State Council. There are several stories documenting Waldheim's friendship with the Chinese people, and one of the most prominent is his tribute to Premier Zhou Enlai. Upon Zhou Enlai's death, Waldheim commanded the flag at the United Nations headquarters to be flown at half-mast. In a momentous speech, Waldheim insinuated that anyone who could do what Premier Zhou had, which was to leave no savings and no children behind, could also be honored with the lowering of the flag to half-mast. His words were met by a stunned congregation of diplomats. followed by a thunderous round of applause. While Waldheim indeed admired Zhou Enlai, it should be noted that a UN rule enacted in 1947 stipulates that flags must be flown at half-mast for a day of mourning when the head of state or government of a member state passes away. This person is Salim, the representative from Tanzania. His journey in the 1960s as the ambassador to China and North Korea highlighted his good relationship with China. In 1971, when China returned to the United Nations, the joy was so immense that an African delegate danced on the spot as the results were announced. Salim had a long tenure as Tanzania's representative to the United Nations for almost a decade, and later served as Tanzania's foreign minister. In June 1981, the Organization of African Unity OAU, a group comprising more than 50 countries, unanimously selected Salim as their candidate for the position of UN Secretary-General, representing the African continent. China also wished to join the third world countries in electing Salim as the new UN Secretary-General. At just 39 years old, Salim ran for the position of UN Secretary-General. Without question, the race for the new UN Secretary-General was going to be a head-to-head competition between Waldheim and Salim. The most significant countries backing these two contestants were the United States and China, respectively. On October 27, 1981, the contest officially commenced. Inside a small chamber of the Security Council, delegates received their ballots and, with little hesitation, the Chinese and American delegates quickly ticked off the candidates' names. The outcome of the first round of voting was 11 votes for Salim and 10 for Waldheim in the election for the post of UN Secretary-General. Although both Salim and Waldheim met the first requirement of at least 9 votes, they failed the second as one permanent member each voted against them. In the secret ballot, it became known that China voted against Waldheim and the United States against Salim. Thus, a second round of voting was conducted. As the US representative began to cajole other delegates, Salim's vote saw a drastic drop in subsequent rounds. On the other hand, Waldheim maintained a steady 10 votes, though was never elected because of China's consistent opposition. This led to the suspension of the voting process. When the voting recommenced the next day, Waldheim still led with 3 votes, but China's continuous opposition led again to the suspension of voting. On November 4th, after 6 days of discussions, appeals, and behind-the-scenes negotiations, the Council conducted the 7th and 8th rounds of voting. However, the results remained the same, with Salim receiving 9 and 8 votes respectively, while Waldheim secured 10 votes in both rounds. Neither was elected due to the continued opposition by both China and the United States. Originally seen as a natural ally of African countries, the USSR's decision to abstain from voting catapulted China's popularity in Africa. Tanzanian staff members would address Chinese personnel in Kiswahili, expressing their solidarity. Despite this, pressure on China and third world countries mounted, with rumors suggesting that after 8 rounds of negative votes, China had already demonstrated sufficient goodwill to its African brothers and would compromise in the next round. In the past, China had exhibited a similar stance of initially opposing but eventually compromising when it seemed that the candidate it supported from an African country stood no chance of winning. However, this time around, China clarified its position again. Up to this point, the United Nations comprised 157 member states, the majority of which were non-aligned and third world countries. Despite this, among the 4 UN Secretaries-General till then, only 1 was Asian and 3 were European. This discrepancy provoked an uproar, given the significant role that third world countries played in the organization. Amid this, Ling King, China's representative to the UN, received a clear directive from Deng Xiaoping at home. Note to the end. After the vote had been put on hold for nearly 2 weeks, it was resumed on November 17th. On that day, the UN Security Council held 8 subsequent rounds of voting. In the first round, Waldheim received 11 votes, while Salim got 10. The second round saw Waldheim securing 10 votes and Salim 9. In the last 6 rounds, Waldheim received 9 votes and Salim 8 in each. Though the number of votes fluctuated slightly with each round, China and the US each cast 8 dissenting votes, resulting in a standstill. After 21 long days and 16 rounds of voting, and despite the other 3 permanent members abstaining, China and the United States came at loggerheads, casting 16 consecutive negative votes. This has never happened before in the history of the United Nations, leaving many a loss of what comes next. 2 alternatives were suggested. Firstly, having Waldheim re-elected for a term of 1 or 2 years and then seeking re-election. Secondly, Waldheim and Salem sharing the 5-year term of the next UN Secretary-General. Nevertheless, rumors started circulating that China was ready to accept the second option. Quickly squashing these rumors, the Chinese representative issued a statement firmly expressing their unwavering support for Third World candidates and thoroughly rejecting any manipulation of the United Nations affairs by 1 or 2 superpowers. Wang Hua, China's vice premier and foreign minister, reaffirmed this during an official visit to Nigeria, leaving no doubt about China's commitment to African countries. However, even after 16 further rounds of voting, it was clear that this would not lead to the election of a new Secretary-General. In this standstill, Waldheim, who had always held a good rapport with China, reached out to China's UN representative Ling Qing to inquire about their next move. Ling Qing responded that China's stance was principled and not personal against Waldheim. He mentioned that Waldheim had already enjoyed the high honor of serving as Secretary-General for 10 out of 36 years of UN's existence, and China's insistence to support a Third World candidate was justified. Waldheim completely understood and made his decision. On December 3, 1981, he wrote a letter to the Security Council's president, requesting his name to be omitted in the next Secretary-General selection, effectively forfeiting his candidacy. 5 days after Waldheim's withdrawal, Salem to boat out of the race, seeing that the United States wouldn't change its favorable vote towards him. This 16-round deadlock was finally broken. On December 9, the UN Security Council announced 9 new contenders for the Secretary-General post, all from Third World countries, including Argentina, Iran, Peru, Guyana, Panama, the Philippines, Mauritius, Ecuador, and Colombia. On December 11, 1981, following another round of voting, Thérèse de Cuéllar from Peru was elected as the UN's next Secretary-General. Interestingly, China voted in favor while the US did not vote against. At the age of 61, de Cuéllar became the second Secretary-General from Third World in the history of the United Nations. In his inauguration, he stated that he would never forget his developing country origins. He visited China on August 21, 1982, when the new UN Secretary-General, de Cuéllar, visited China. He was received by Deng Xiaoping at Zhongnanhai. Deng expressed, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China is fully aware of its responsibilities. Everyone can trust us on 2 things. 1. We adhere to principles, and 2. We honor our words. We don't play political or linguistic games. Personally, I enjoy bridge, but China doesn't play cards in politics. Deng then proceeded to clarify China's foreign policy, stating that it was consistent. 1. To oppose hegemony. 2. To safeguard world peace. 3. To strengthen solidarity and cooperation with the Third World. Selected writings of Deng Xiaoping. De Cuéllar was re-elected for a second term, with China again voting in favor. However, the context for China's decision to vote against the UN for 16 rounds in 1981 is significant to note. Back then, recently elected President Ronald Reagan had shown considerable hostility towards China. Early in his term, he expressed support for Taiwan and the arms sale to them. China and the US were in a deadlock over Taiwan's arms deal at the time. In these talks, China's position was discussed. 1. They hoped for continued growth of China-US relations, but the US was mistaken if they saw China as insignificant or unworthy. 2. It was a misconception to assume that the US wasn't in need of China even though China needed the US. 3. On the Taiwan issue, China would remain firm even if China-US relations regressed. Deng Xiaoping's Selected Writings, Volume 2, People's Publishing House, 1994 edition. The election for the UN Secretary-General 9 months later was not only a standard election, but also a strategic move by China, with an intention of stunning its opponents. The day after Waldheim's withdrawal, China and the U.S. resumed their negotiations in Beijing over the Taiwan arms sales issue. 8 grueling months of negotiations later, the two nations issued the August 17 communique, wherein the U.S. made significant concessions. This document, along with the U.S. China Shanghai Communique and the Communique on the Establishment of Diplomatic Relations, laid the foundation for a healthy U.S. China relationship. The 8-year term under President Reagan is often seen as a golden period in U.S. China relations, while not every event that followed can be directly linked to China's assertive stance during the UN Secretary-General election. It certainly played a part. The diplomatic stage requires shrewd tactics. Knowing when to be firm, when to compromise, and how to balance is a learning pursuit. Of course, behind these means, the core still resides in one's individual strength. No matter how the situation unfolds, one must maintain their resolve.